And let's consider this man, Stephen. What kind of guy was he? What kind of guy would actually stand there and get stoned to death? Do you know how hard that would be? Do you know how painful that would be? You ever been hit by a rock? I have 2 caps in my front teeth. I've had since I was 9 years old, one of them. I was sitting beside the sidewalk. My brother and I and another guy, Danny Flynn, were trying to break a big rock. We're brilliant guys. We're trying to throw this rock on the concrete and break the rock. Well, I threw it, didn't break. Danny threw it, didn't break. My brother threw it, didn't break. And so Danny and I said, that's enough. This is crazy. We're kind of idiots here. Michael, though, he decided, my brother, that he could probably break that thing. And so Danny and I just sat down. And I'm sitting down, Michael's throwing that rock. He bounced that thing off the ground. It hit me right in the mouth. The only thing that broke was my tooth. Straight across, halfway. He just broke that thing. It hurt. It hurt for a long time. In fact, I'm still traumatized. He got hit by a rock. And I thought, Stephen was pummeled to death by rocks. How horrible a death. Horrible death. But he was a Greek. He brought something very new to the church. All the Jews were being saved, but he was a Greek Jew. So he brought in kind of a foreign theme, a sense. He was there in Jerusalem. He was Greek in his language. He was Greek in his culture. He was still a Jew, but he was a Greek. And so he was a little bit different. Here's what Acts 4:13 says about the disciples. The disciples were from Galilee, and they were, quote, ignorant and unlearned men. That was a description of them. But along comes Stephen, and he's a little different. Look back at Acts chapter 6 right now, and let's consider something about Stephen. He is a lot like Jesus. They're both their deaths are in several chapters, and they're a lot alike in their character. And I want us to think about how they were alike in their lives. They both preached, they both produced some miracles, and they were both put to death for it. You would have thought, looking at Jesus' life, that people would have said, let me see, he raised people from the dead, he healed the sick, he cast out demons, he cared for people, he loved people. And when you think about Jesus, we generally think about Jesus as being a nice, kind, gentlemanly, nice man. And you would be correct. Some of the time. But they didn't kill him because he was so nice. And they didn't kill him because he healed people. And they didn't kill Jesus because he set people free from their bondages. They didn't kill him because he cast demons out. They didn't kill him because he was kind and compassionate. So you have to think about the view you have of Jesus. When we look at some scriptures here and consider what Stephen and Jesus were like, your picture of Jesus ought to change a little, or at least if you think he's just this loving, kind, sweet man, it ought to change some. They preached, they produced miracles, and they were put to death. They both had, look at Acts chapter 6 and verse 8. There's something that describes both these men. 6 verse 8 says, and Stephen, full of grace and power. So you have him full of grace and power. Now, grace is an interesting word here. You say, okay, he's full of grace. I guess that kind of means Stephen was real spiritual, full of grace. No, I think that's not what the word grace here means. What that word means right here is he's beautiful. He's tender. He's compassionate. When you think about Jesus, you think about that portion of him where he's beautiful and tender and compassionate and loving, and his arms are open wide. I remember as a young man sensing the presence of Jesus with his arms open wide to me and saying, I'm so glad you've returned. I'll never forget seeing that picture of Jesus with his arms open wide saying, I'm so glad you've returned. That compassionate, loving eyes. You know the eyes that you look at that just love you? Do you know what it's like when someone loves you and you look at them in the eye and you can just see it? They love you. And how compassionate it feels, how good that feels. Do you know how it feels when someone just accepts you like you are? Don't you like that? Isn't it nice that there are people in the world who just put their arm around you, hug you, or slap you on the back, or just tell you you're great and they just love you? Isn't it nice to just have someone who just likes you? I like you. Isn't that nice? It's nice to hear, isn't it? It's true, too. Doesn't that make you feel good? You might not even like me, but if I say I like you, you say, oh, I might like you now. It just makes you feel good. So when you think of someone who has this kind of grace, you're really thinking about someone who is welcoming to you, who just makes you feel comfortable. That's what God is like when you receive Him. When you turn your life over to God, you sense that God is loving and accepting and compassionate and receiving and gives you a big old hug. And when we're praying here earlier this morning, there were times when some of you stood and somebody came up to you and they put their hand on you and they prayed for you, and there's this sense of, oh, God loves me. He understands. He cares. Peter said, cast all your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. That's this full of grace part. This is the part where the guy smiles and you just are glad to be in His presence. I think of an old friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, Jeff Lloyd, and this is the description of Jeff Lloyd to me. He was just a smiling, happy, calm, relaxed, accepting, loving, kind gentleman. And when I thought of Stephen, I thought of Jeff. But I thought of something else about him. Because Stephen, Jeff, Jesus were not only full of grace, they were full of power. You say, oh, I know he can great miracles and great things like that. But let me tell you that power is strength. I think I have it written here: strength and vigor and determination, dignity, authority. You know, when they talked about Jesus, they said that He spoke like no other scribes or no one else. He spoke with authority. Where did that authority come from? Well, it wasn't because He sat in the synagogue and was trained. It wasn't because He went to college and got a degree. It wasn't that He had a PhD in theology. His authority came from His relationship to the Father. And because of that, He spoke what He heard the Father say. And He had an authority that went way beyond education. And so did Stephen. Stephen had this kind of power. Now, if you watched in the video, did you notice when they falsely accused him and the battle started and the fight started, they started to argue with him at first, and in the arguing with him, they just couldn't seem to convince anyone. That it just seemed like Stephen had this authority and power that they just didn't have, and their response to Stephen's authority was to get angry. The response to the Jesus authority was to get angry at him. Rather than look and say, whoa, this guy has such grace and compassion and ability, and he speaks with such great authority, I ought to submit myself to this guy. Oh no. When I see that kind of authority, I fight it. It's that when authority speaks, those under have a response. It will either be, yes sir, yes ma'am, whatever you say. Wouldn't that be nice, parents? If our kids would say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and just listen to authority. Or they could say, no. No. One of the programs Mary Jo and I like to watch is it's about parents, and it's called, well, the kids call it Parents from Hell, I think, but it's called The Strictest Parents. You know, and the kids hate it because these parents are strict and they're trying to get these kids in line, and what they're basically trying to do is break their will so that they will submit. Because once a kid's will is broken and they begin to submit, then they can grow, and then they can learn, and then they can flourish. But rather than submit to the authority of Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees decided they would fight it, and they killed him. They killed him because they hated the power and authority they saw in his life.